Put your hats on. You need hats, folks.
Do we have what? There's not to buy. You will buy hat? For what?
I wonder if it's got any brakes. So you don't see this every day. You get to the cable car which takes you to the top of Hong Kong.
You lose your stuff. You have to walk down to there.
אנא היזהרו מהדלתות החשמליות. אנו מאחלים לכם ביקור מהנה.
Please be careful of the automatic doors. We hope you enjoy your visit.
Ay, di partner ko. Nawala yung partner ko yun.
Kat, where are you?
Padaan mo sila.
Yun yun, baka wala na yung malalakaran niyo. Pahulog na pala kayo, ha?
Masada.
Tingin-tingin din. May time. Tayo lang nagpapayong dito, eh. Ay,
Sa loob na sila.
Ate? Ano?
sundan niyo siya. Sundan niyo siya. Hindi ko magkakargang tubig. Sundan niyo na siya.
Grabe. Wow. Yan ang Dead Sea. Oh. Grabe. Kitang sasakyan.
It's good to have a fan, eh? You've got your own personal fan club. Okay. You are a great team. You know, the Romans had their legions. You know what Antony calls you? He calls you the legion. Yeah, because you listen, you're well disciplined, and absolutely fabulous.
Thank you.
Okay, so we've made it onto the mountain. This is a quarry from which they extracted rocks. There are many more quarries on the top of the mountain. We're basically at sea level here, so we're just over 430 meters above sea level. There were several lookout towers. There's one there at the north, there's one in the middle, and there's one at the south. And surrounding the mountain was a double wall. Remember I spoke in Beersheba about the double wall?
Yes.
Okay, and also I mentioned Jericho and Rahab living between the walls. Similar sort of thing here. It was part of a siege defense mentality. So if you built a fortress, no matter where, if you had a double wall system that went round the whole thing, people could live between the walls and they would be looking out all the time just to see what's going on. So that's good. So this is the quarry, one of them, one of the many quarries. Rock-wise, this is dolomitic limestone, the same as the Judean mountains. So it's very good rock. We do not get rain here. And dolomitic limestone is actually porous, which means that water can flow through it, and it would be a big problem to this mountain if that happened, because the sides of the mountain are cracked. So where we're standing, we think that this was probably where the top Roman officer lived after Herod died, and the Romans took charge of all of Herod's territory after his sons did a very bad job. So we call this the commandant's residence. Let's just wander in. We'll wander in and wander through, and we can take pictures. There's a little
Video ka.
Let me come out so you can come in. When the plaster is wet, you put colours into the plaster in the pattern that you wanted to create. And without that, you can see the plaster behind the colours. This is all original. So we're 3,000
Nakakita na labas.
We'll just go through into this room. This is the room with the view. It's got a lovely little window. Look at that. Look at that. Yes, off you go. If you like a view of the Dead Sea, there it is.
Wow.
And everybody calls him a master builder. But it wasn't Herod that did all this. It was Roman engineering. and it was the slave. This is the central courtyard, surrounded by rooms, some of which were called local wall paintings. Those who got behind the family. Keep walking, keep sipping. Okay, if you want to position yourself around this model, but don't block other people's view. It's always good to be a visual learner. That film was good, wasn't it? Yeah. It gave you a really good basic history of what took place here. Let's come round. Let's remember Psalm 18 verse 1. What was that? For King David, he said, I love you, O Lord my God. You are my rock, my refuge, my fortress. Fortress in Hebrew is Masada. Where are we?
Masada.
You got it. Okay. So this is the seventh and most southerly of King Herod's own personal fortresses, if he fell upon bad times. And he deserved to, because he was a rotten stinker. If I was to sum him up in a couple of sentences, he was a madman who exacted tons of taxes from his people. He was a half-Jew. He killed every single wise person in Israel, including the rabbinical scholars, if they were any sort of a threat to him. He killed everybody in his family, other than those who outlived him. He was a rotten egg. If you think about it, there have been a few other rotten eggs in the world. The most recent, perhaps, I'll take him back to, who was that chap in Uganda? Can't remember his name.
Amin?
That you got it! Yes. He was not a good guy. And I actually think Herod died a pretty nasty death. But there you go. So he died in 4 BC, but he had built this. We know from what we found when the archaeologists came here that the Hasmoneans, who were the Maccabees, remember they got rid of the Greeks in 142, and they actually lived here until they lived in Israel and controlled Israel and returned Judaism to the people of Israel and led people back to the worship of Yahweh, who was the one true God of Israel. They did all that, but in 63 BCE, Pompey and a big legion of Romans came in from the north and took control. So Herod came into his standing as client king for the Romans in 37 BCE. Okay? So here we are. We've come up the little steps. This, we said, was the commandant's residence. When the rebels came here, after Jerusalem had been destroyed, after the rebellion in the Galilee, the Golan, anywhere else in Israel had been quelled, people escaped from Jerusalem. First of all, they went to Qumran, which is up there. This is where the Dead Sea sect, the Essenes, wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Romans came down, they destroyed and killed anybody that escaped, went to En-Gedi. We're going to En-Gedi after this. It's just over there. I'll point it out from the northern place. The Romans followed them, and then they destroyed and killed everybody, and then we were left with Masada. The Americans like to recognize this as the Alamo of Israel, the last stand, as it were. This was the final act of the great revolt that broke out in Caesarea Maritima, the capital of the Roman Empire, for 600 years on the Mediterranean coast. This is the final act of the revolt, which broke out in 66 and finished in Masada in 73 AD, okay, after Christ. So this is a big deal, the story. Now in the story, in the film, they talked about 967 people, something like that. The historian of the time, Josephus, tells us that 2 women and 3 children were found in a cave who actually authenticated Josephus's writings. We scratch our heads with Josephus because a lot of his numbers were not great. He embellished an awful lot. We've got to remember that he was once a Jewish general, and he was defeated and he didn't die with his troops. He actually jumped sides and he helped the Romans. He became their historian. But he would have had a Roman historian looking over his shoulder and sort of saying, put a few more noughts on that one. You know, for example, the 3 great feasts in Jerusalem, he talks about millions. It's impossible that there would have been millions who came to Jerusalem for Pesach, Shavuot and Sukkot. Impossible. 500,000, even that's pretty massive, but that's more like it. So an awful lot of what Josephus writes, we take with what we call a pinch of salt. Where'd you get the salt from? No problem. Yes, no problem. And out of salt, if you use the Latin, you get sal, which is salary. It was actually given to the Roman legions as part of their, you know, what they were issued as Roman soldiers. So salt was a very important thing. Here's that casemate wall, the double wall that went all the way around the mountain, around here. Now I mentioned that the Romans destroyed Qumran, where the Dead Sea sect were. And then they escaped and they came to En Gedi. And then we discovered some scrolls here on Masada. We've actually also found mikveh ot. A mikveh is a ritual purification bath for religious people who follow the laws of Leviticus. And that's what the Essenes would have done. They followed the letter of the law, just as the ultra-Orthodox do today. The Pharisees in the time of Jesus. We found some scrolls here. I'm going to take you into that scroll house and have a little bit of a chat when we get round there. But there were Essenes here. Who else was here amongst the 967? There were rebels. There were Sicaria. There were those that had Roman blood on their hands. The Zealots. Did somebody say Zealots?
Yes, Zealots.
Yeah, well done. Okay, and there were women and there were children. And guess what else there was here? There were gardens. There were donkeys. There were camels. There were horses. There were sheep. There were goats. This was a thriving place. There was enough water in the cisterns that we've discovered in Masada for 1,000 people for 10 years. Wow. If this place needed to come under siege. I'm going to take you through these part of these storehouses in a minute. If you think about the water for 1,000 years, 10 years for 1,000 people. What did I say?
Yeah.
I think I got it wrong. There was enough water here for 10 years for 1,000 people.
Yeah.
Is that what I said?
Yes.
Okay, keep an eye on me because it's hot. And the brain gets muddled. Okay, storehouses. A whole load of storehouses here.
Yes.
We're going to walk through one in a minute. They would have been full at one time. They would have been enclosed. It would have been cooler in there. Remember, there's a trade route here down the bottom. So they could always bring stuff up to fill up their amphora, their pithoi, their big clay jars. We even found clay jars here with evidence that they had been filled with wine. And the inscription in Latin translates into English, made in Italy. Thank you very much. Expensive. Oh, that's the life, eh? So, you know, for the Romans, wherever they were in their empire, they would bring it in. They would bring it in. They probably ate spaghetti. Stuff like that too. Why not? There's probably a few McDonald's up here. No. As soon as there's a McDonald's up here, I'm stopping guiding. And I wouldn't put it past, you know, it could happen. Please, no. Okay, so storehouse. It's hot out there, so I just want to tell you very briefly. Again, this is another home, a house. There's a frescoed wall with murals. There's a plastered wall with a fresco on it, completely original underneath the black line. You don't have to go in there, but if you want to take a picture, that's fine. It's 3,000 feet from north to south. This is the south, behind me is the north. That's the west, so we're heading towards the Judean hills and falling away into the coastal plain to the Mediterranean, the biblical Great Sea. Behind me is the east. This is the Dead Sea. That was over there, the mountains of the Moabites. It became under the rule of the Nabateans in the time of Jesus. Okay, the Moabites were not in charge, the Nabateans were. The